Hi guys, this is Interesting Andrew. We're going to continue. This will be a part two of The History of England by David Hume. This chapter is chapter 3. It's on page 8. If you're downloading it from the public domain, it should be somewhere around there, depending on what version. But chapter 3 is the subject of the Britons again. And my beginning notes are the power vacuum left by the Romans' departure left the unwarlike Britons exposed to invasion from the Scots and the Picts. So, the following chapters we'll be doing are pretty short, except for the one on the Saxons, which will be chapter 4. So we're just going to read it and then knock it out, and then that'll be it. So the Britons, the abject Britons regarded this present of liberty as fatal to them, and were in no condition to put in practice the prudent counsel given to them by the Romans, to arm in their own defense, unaccustomed both to the perils of war and to the cares of civil government. They found themselves incapable of forming or executing any measures for resisting the incursions of the barbarians. Gratian, also, and Constantine, two Romans who had a little before assumed the purple in Britain, had carried over to the continent the flower of the British youth, having perished in their unsuccessful attempts on the imperial throne, had despoiled the island of those who, in this desperate extremity, were best able to defend it. The amount of Gaul in like English blood near the end of the Roman Empire before it became the Eastern and Western Empire was pretty substantial. If you do a quick Google search, for instance, you find there to be several that were from Gaul, so France, and then several who had some connection to the island as well. And also because they were recruiting these people from their frontier to serve in their military, they are really gathering all the best who could have ordered the civilization there and help them to fend off against the invasion of the barbarians. But because Rome needed its own soldiers, they pulled from that blood pool, and they left them pretty desperate. So the Picts and the Scots, finding that the Romans had finally relinquished Britain, now regarded the whole as their prey, and attacked the northern wall with redoubled forces. The Britons had already subdued by their own fears, found the ramparts but a weak defense for them. In deserting their station, left the country entirely open to the inroads of the barbarous enemy. The invaders carried devastation and ruin along with them and exerted the utmost their native ferocity, which was not mitigated by the helpless condition and submissive behavior of the inhabitants. So there was no pity or mercy shown. Oh, sorry. The unhappy Britons had a third time recourse to Rome, which had declared its resolution before forever to abandon them. Aetius, the patrician, sustained at that time by his valor and magnanimity the tottering Romans of the empire, and revived for a moment among the degenerate Romans the spirit as well as the discipline of their ancestors. The British ambassadors carried to him a letter from their countrymen, which was inscribed, "The groans of the Britons." The tenor of the epistle was suitable to its superscription. The barbarians of the Britons, the tenor of the epistle was suitable. The barbarians, say they, on the one hand, chase us into the sea on the other throws us back upon the barbarians. And we have only the hard choice left to us of perishing by the sword or by the waves. But Aetius, pressed by the arms of Attila the Hun, The most terrible enemy that had ever assailed the empire had no leisure to attend to the complaints of allies, whom generosity alone could induce him to assist. They could not offer him gold. They could not offer him grain. They could not offer him anything. So the only reason for him to go to war on their behalf would be through his own generous spirit, which would be suicide at this point. The Britons, thus rejected, were reduced to despair, deserted their habitations, abandoned tillage, and flying for the protection to the forests and mountains, suffered equally from hunger and from the enemy. The barbarians themselves began to feel the pressures of famine in a country which they had ravaged, and being harassed by the dispersed Britons who had not dared to resist them in a body, they retreated with their spoils into their own country. So naturally, just like the fall of Rome, just like any riot, after some time of fast gain of valuables, of resources, um, the ensuing desperation that follows uh, was universal. Everyone began to starve. Everyone was left bankrupt, and that's their fault. It's the savages, the vandals, the barbarians at the gates that time and time again destroy civilization, and then not having the skills to rebuild or sustain themselves are left destitute as well. So their own avarice is their own downfall. My 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 language for people like that is strong. So the Britons taking advantage. Yeah, the Britons taking advantage of this interval returned to their usual occupations, and the favorable seasons which succeeded, seconding their industry, made them soon forget their past miseries and restored to them a great plenty of all the necessaries of life. No more can be imagined to have been possessed by a people so rude who had not, without the assistance of the Romans, art of masonry sufficient to raise a stone rampart for its own defense. Yet the monkish historians who treat of those events complain of the luxury of the Britons during this period and ascribe that to that vice, not to the cowardice or improvident counsels, all their subsequent calamities. So if you remember, this is time after Christ. The Romans pulled out around 450 AD. So they already had missions there. They have bishops there. They have the church. And they say it's their own fault that they did not organize and develop defenses. A reluctant spirit of the people. You see that in Rome as well, where they lose the military spirit, and then they are open to all the invasions of the barbarians that they can muster. Uh, People quit fighting. Today we have what's called the black pill, where you just quit fighting, you quit caring because everything's doomed. It's the same spirit that they have. The Britons, entirely occupied in the enjoyment of the present interval of peace, made no provision of resisting the enemy, who, invited by their former timid behavior, soon threatened them with a new invasion. We are not exactly informed what species of civil government the Romans on their departure left among the Britons, but it appears probable that the great men in different districts assumed a kind of regal, though precarious authority, and lived in a great measure independent of each other. To this disunion of councils were also added the disputes of theology and the disciples of Pelagius, who was himself a native of Britain, having increased to a great multitude, gave alarm to the clergy, who seemed to have been more intent on suppressing them than on opposing the public enemy. Laboring on these domestic evils and menaced by foreign invasions, the Britons attended only to the suggestions of their present fears, following the counsels of Vortigern, Prince of Dumnonium, who, though stained with every vice, possessed the chief authority among them. They sent into Germany a deputation to invite over the Saxons to their protection and assistance. So that would lead into chapter 4 on the Saxons. If you don't know who the Saxons are, they're the Germanic tribe that has been inflicting a lot of pain on Rome. But if you offer them gold, maybe they'll be good mercenaries. After all, the Roman army uses mercenaries at this point, almost wholly. And so, using these Germans who are a warlike tribe, maybe that's a good idea. So, chapter 4, this is on page 10, the Saxons. Of all the barbarous nations, known either in ancient and modern times, the Germans seem to have been the most distinguished both by their manners and political institutions, and to have carried in the highest pitch of virtues of valor and love of liberty, the only virtues which have place among uncivilized people, where justice and humanity are commonly neglected. Kingly government, even when established among Germans, for it was not universal, possessed a very limited authority, and though the sovereign was usually chosen among the royal family, he was directed in every measure by common consent of the nation over whom he presided. I remember Julius Caesar wrote about the German tribes when he went into Germany, and actually wrote his own book on it. And then Gibbons also very heavily relied on that material to describe them in a historical detail. They had clans, they had kings or chiefs that were just warlords, and they all pretty much sustained themselves on war. So, my quick note I took of this chapter was inviting a greedy ally results in a quick change in fortune for the Britons. Their Saxon liberators, in quotations, quickly sought to control the whole of the British Isles. They saw the weakness and they jumped on it again. How many times is Britain going to be prey to warlike tribes? So, the leaders of their military companions were maintained by the labor of their slaves or by those of the weaker and less warlike part of the community whom they defended. The contributions which they levied went not beyond a bare subsistence, and the honors acquired by a superior rank were the only reward of their superior dangers and fatigues. All the refined arts of life were unknown among the Germans. Tillage itself was almost wholly neglected. They even seem to have been anxious to prevent any improvements of that nature, and the leaders, by annually distributing anew all the land among the inhabitants of each village, kept them from attaching themselves to particular possessions or making such progress in agriculture as might divert their attention from military expeditions, the chief occupation of the community. So, by annually rotating where each tribe lives, they prevent you from building towns. They prevent you from growing crops and leave you desperate to only conduct war. It's kind of nefarious. But maybe they just thought it was dishonorable. So, the Saxons had been for some time regarded as one of the most warlike tribes of this fierce people and had become the terror of the neighboring nations. They had diffused themselves in the northern parts of Germany, in the Cimbrian and Chersonesus, and had taken possession of all the sea coast from the mouth of the Rhine to the Jutland, whence they had long infested by their piracies all the eastern and southern parts of Britain and northern Gaul. In order to oppose the inroads, the Romans had established an officer whom they called the Count of Saxon Shore, and as the naval arts can flourish among a civilized people alone, they seem to have been more successful in repelling the Saxons than any of the other barbarians by whom they were invaded. The dissolution of the Roman power invited them to renew their inroads, and it was acceptable circumstance that these deputies of the Britons appeared among them, and prompted them to undertake an enterprise which they were of themselves sufficiently inclined to render them aid, conduct war on the Scots and Picts. Hengist and Horsa, two brothers, possessed of great credit among the Saxons, and were much celebrated both of their valor and nobility. They were reputed as the most as most of the Saxon princes to be sprung from what he writes Woden, which is Odin, as we know him today, who was worshipped as a god among the nations, and they are said to be his great grandsons of circumstance which added to their authority. The two brothers, observing the other provinces of Germany to be occupied by a warlike and necessitous people, to the rich provinces of Gaul, already conquered and overrun by other German tribes, found it easy to persuade their countrymen to embrace the sole enterprise which comprised a favorable opportunity of displaying their valor and gratifying their avidity. They embarked their troops in 3 vessels, and about the year 450, earned over 1,600 men, who landed on the Isle of Thanet and immediately marched to the defense of the Britons against the northern invaders. The Scots and the Picts were unable to resist the valor of these auxiliaries, and the Britons, applauding their own wisdom and calling over the Saxons, hoped thenceforth to enjoy peace and security under the powerful protection of that warlike people. But Hengist and Horsa, perceiving that their easy victory over the Scots and Picts with what facility they might subdue the Britons themselves, who had not been able to resist those feeble invaders, were determined to conquer the fight for their own grandeur, not for the defense of their degenerate allies. Again, they did not respect civilization. They sent intelligence to Saxony of the fertility and the riches of Britain, represented as certain the subjection of the people so long disused to arms, who, being now cut off from the Roman Empire, of which they had been a province during so many ages, had not yet acquired any union among themselves, and were destitute of all affection to their new liberties, and of all their national attachments and regards. The vices and pusillanimity of Vortigern, their British leader, were a new ground of hope, and the Saxons in Germany, following such agreeable prospects, soon reinforced Hengist and Horsa with 5,000 men, who came over in 17 vessels. The Britons now began to entertain apprehensions of their allies, whose numbers they had found continually augmenting, but thought of no remedy except a passive submission and connivance. This weak expedient soon failed them, as the Saxons sought to quarrel and find any reason to say that they were breaking the treaties. Britons, impelled by these violent extremities and roused to indignation against their treacherous auxiliaries, were necessitated to take arms, and having deposed Vortigern, who had become odious from his vices and from the bad event of his rash counsels, they put themselves under the command of his son, Vortimer. They fought many battles with their enemies, and though the victories in these actions be disputed between the British and Saxon annalists, the progress still made by the Saxons proved that the advantage was commonly on their side. In one battle, however, Figglesford kills, now Aylesford, Horsa. The Saxon general was slain and left the sole command of his countrymen in the hands of Hengist. This active general, continually reinforced by fresh numbers from Germany, carried devastation into the most remote corners of Britain. And being chiefly anxious to spread the terror of his arms, he spared neither age, nor sex, nor condition. Wherever he marched with his victorious forces, the private and public edifices of Britons were reduced to ash. The priests were slaughtered on the altars by the idolatrous ravagers. The bishops and nobility shared the same fate as the vulgar. The people, flying to the mountains and deserts, were intercepted and butchered in heaps. Some were glad to accept life in servitude under the victors. Others, deserting their native country, took shelter in the province of America, where, being charitably received by a people of the same language and manners, they settled in great numbers and gave the country the name of Brittany. The British writers assign one cause to the facilitated entrance of the Saxons into this island: the love with which Vortigern was at first seized for Rowena, the daughter of Hengist, and which that artful warrior made use to his blind his eyes of the imprudent monarch, some historians add that Vortimer died, and Vortigern, being restored to the throne, accepted a banquet of Hengist at Stonehenge, where 300 of his nobility were treacherously slaughtered and himself detained captive. But these stories seem to have been invented by Welsh authors in order to palliate the weak resistance made first by their countrymen and to account for the rapid progress and licentious devastations of the Saxons. So essentially, that tale was a fable created to save face that their ancestors did not show the backbone to protect their land and their people. Hengist, however, notwithstanding their opposition, still maintained his ground in Britain, and in order to divide the forces in the attention of the natives, he called over a new tribe of Saxons under the command of Octa Abissa and of Abissa, the son of Octa, and he settled them in Northumberland. He himself remained in the southern parts of the island and laid the foundation for the kingdom of Kent, comprehending the county of the name of Middlesex, Essex, and a part of Surrey. He fixed his royal seat at Canterbury, where he governed for about 40 years and died near the year 488, leaving his new acquired dominions to his posterity. The success of Hengist excited the avidity of the northern Germans, and at different times, under different leaders, they flocked over multitudes to the invasion of this island. These conquerors were chiefly composed of three tribes, the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, who all passed under common appellations, sometimes of Saxons, others Angles, and speaking the same language and being governed by the same institutions. They themselves were naturally led from all these causes, as well as from their common interest, to unite themselves against the ancient inhabitants. The resistance, however, though unequal, was still maintained by the Britons, but became every day more feeble, and their calamities admitted a few intervals till they were driven into Cornwall and Wales and received protection from their remote situation and inaccessible mountains of the countries. The first Saxon state, after that of Kent, which was established in Britain, was the kingdom of South Saxony. Around in the year 477, Ila, a Saxon chief, brought over an army from Germany, and landing on the southern coast, proceeded to take possession of the neighboring territory. The Britons, now armed, did not tamely abandon their possessions, nor were they expelled till defeated in many battles by their warlike invaders. The most memorable action mentioned by historians is that of Mercredus Burn, where though the Saxons seem to have obtained the victory, they suffered so considerable a loss as somewhat retarded the progress of their conquests. But Aila, reinforced by fresh numbers of his countrymen, again took the field against the Britons and laid siege to Ansered Seister, which was defended by the garrison and inhabitants with desperate valor. The Saxons, enraged by this resistance and by the fatigues and dangers which they had sustained, redoubled their efforts against the place, and when masters of it, put all the enemies to the sword without distinction. This decisive advantage secured the conquest of Aila, who assumed the name of king and extended his domain over Sussex and a great part of Surrey. He was stopped in his progress to the east by the kingdom of Kent, and that to the west by another tribe of Saxons who had taken possession of that territory. These Saxons, from the situation of the country in which they settled, were called the West Saxons, and landed in the year 495, under the command of Cerdric and his son Kenric. The Britons were, by past experience, so much on their guard and so well prepared to receive the enemy that they gave battle to Cedric the very day of his landing, and though vanquished, still defended for some time their liberties against the invaders. None of the other tribes of the Saxons met such vigorous resistance or exerted such valor and perseverance in pushing their conquests. Cerdic was even obliged to call for the assistance of his countrymen from the kingdoms of Kent and Sussex, as well as from Germany, and he thence joined the fresh army under the command of Port and his sons Bleda and Megla. Strengthened by these succors, he fought in the year 508 a desperate battle with the Britons, commanded by uh, Nazan Leod, who was victorious in the beginning of his action and routed the wing in which Cedric Leod, who was victorious in the beginning of the action and routed the wing in which Cedric himself commanded. But Kenric, who prevailed in another wing, brought timely assistance to his father and restored the battle, which ended in complete victory gained by the Saxons. Nazan Leod perished with 5,000 of his army, but the Britons, more weakened than discouraged by his death, the war still continued, though success was commonly on the side of the Saxons, whose short swords and manner in fighting gave them great advantage over the missile weapons of the Britons. Cerdic was not wanting to in good fortune, and in order to extend his conquests, laid siege to Mount Badon, or Banesdown, near Bath, whither the most obstinate and most discomfited Britons had retired. The southern Britons in this extremity applied for assistance to Arthur, king of the Silures, whose heroic valor now sustained the declining fate of his country. This is that Arthur so much celebrated in the songs of the Lycian and in the British bards, and whose military achievements have been blended with so many fables as even to give occasion for entertaining doubts of his real existence. But poets, though they disfigure the most certain history by their fictions and use strange liberties with truth, where they are the sole historians, as among the Britons, have commonly some foundation for the wildest exaggerations. Certain it is that the siege of Badon was raised by the Britons in the year 520, and as Saxons there were discomfited in a great battle. This misfortune stopped the progress of Cerdic, but was not sufficient to wrest him from his conquest, which he had already made. He and his son Kenric, who succeeded him, established a kingdom in West Saxons, or of Wessex, over the counties Hants, Dorset, Wilts, Berks, and the Isle of Wight, and left their new acquired dominions to their posterity. Cerdic died at 534, Kenric in 560. While the Saxons made progress in the south, their countrymen were not less active in other quarters. In the year 527, a great tribe of adventurers, under several leaders, landed on the east coast of Britain, and after fighting many battles, of which history has preserved no particular account, they established 3 new kingdoms in the island. Ufa assumed the title as king of the East Angles in 575, Creta that of Mercia in 585, and Erkinswin that of East Saxony or Essex. Nearly at that same time, but the year is uncertain, the latter kingdom was dismembered from that of Kent and comprehended Essex, Middlesex, and part of Hertfordshire, that of East Angles. The counties of Cambridge, Suffolk, Norfolk, and Mercia were extended over all those middle counties, from the banks of the Severn to the frontiers of these 2 kingdoms. The Saxons, soon after the landing of Hengist, had been planted in Northumberland, but as they met with the obstinate resistance, made but small progress in subduing the inhabitants. Their affairs were in so unsettled a condition that none of their princes for a long time assumed the appellation of king. At last, in 547, Ida, a Saxon prince of great valor, who claimed its descent, as did all the other princes of that nation, from Odin, brought over a reinforcement from Germany and enabled the Northumberlands to carry on with their conquest over the Britons. He entirely subdued the county which is now called Northumberland, the bishopric of Durham, as well as some of the southeast counties of Scotland. And he assumed the crown under the title King of Bernicia, nearly at the same time Aella, another Saxon prince, having conquered Lancashire and a greater part of Yorkshire, received appellation of King of Derry. These 2 kingdoms were united in the persons of Ethelfrid, son of Ida, who married Acca, the daughter of Aella, and expelling her brother Edwin, established one of the most powerful of the Saxon kingdoms, the title of Northumberland. How far his dominions extended into the country now called Scotland is uncertain, but it cannot be doubted that all the lowlands, especially east coast of the country, were now peopled in great measure from Germany. Though the expeditions made by several Saxon adventurers have escaped the records of history, the language spoken in those counties or countries, which was purely Saxon, is a strong proof of this event than can be opposed by the imperfect or rather fabulous annals which are obtruded by those Scottish historians. And that ends chapter 4 in our reading. But as you can tell, the Germans just pillaged and destroyed so much that the Britain bloodline was completely muddled, if it even survived, with German. And you see this a lot, where if there's not written history, you use language. The language used as proof of a people group populating and taking over an area. And then nowadays we also have archaeology to assist with studying arts, pottery, stuff like that, to also reinforce the study and to determine where people come from, migrate, and conquer. So yeah, that ends our reading today for David Hume's History of England. We'll continue on later, and I will guys see you in the next Interest in Andrew video.